Chairman Stiles, we received a letter from you requesting a close rule, and then we received a letter from Ranking Member Morelli asking not even for an open rule, but for a structured rule. Why are you asking for a closed rule? I mean, do you really think that this bill can't be improved in any way, shape, or form, especially since some of us believe that this bill could disenfranchise millions and millions of people? What's the rationale behind shutting off all amendments for Democrats or Republicans?
We had an amendment process as we went through regular order at the committee level.
You're one committee. I mean, not just the people on your committee care about voting rights. People on the Rules Committee care about voting rights. Judiciary Committee cares about voting rights. I would even say that people on the Transportation Committee care about voting rights. This is a big deal. And some of us believe that this bill will literally disenfranchise millions and millions of people. So I guess what is the justification for not allowing any amendments? Mr. Morelli has an amendment. He's the ranking member on your committee. Why should he be denied the right to offer and debate an amendment on the House floor?
Well, in fact, Mr. Morelli did offer amendments, and we debated those in committee, as I previously noted.
Yeah, so you had 12, how many members on your committee?
There's 12 in
There's 12 members on your committee. There's 435 members of the House. I mean, you don't think we should be able to debate these things, on something that impacts every single district in this country? I'm just stunned that my Republican friends who promised they wanted a more open process continue to insist on shutting down the process and closing things up so that no amendments can be offered. But I ask unanimous consent to put in the record the letters from both Chairman Steil and from Ranking Member Morelli on the request for a rule. I just find it stunning that on an issue, on a topic like this, that really not just 12 members have concerns about, that you are saying that we should shut the process down, which I'm sure that this committee will do, because that's what this committee normally does. Mr. Morelli, Chairman Stiles talked about the massive voter fraud. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, we have 350 million Americans. The odds that one or two non-citizen could ultimately vote, I suppose, is possible. But what's being posited to the American people, and what Speaker Johnson even talked about without having any evidence, the suggestion is that there's massive efforts to get non-U.S. citizens to vote in federal elections. I'll repeat what I said earlier, which is it's illegal to register to vote in the United States if you're not a U.S. citizen. It's a further penalty if you actually voted in a federal election and weren't a U.S. citizen, which leads to deportation. So for all the suggestion that people are doing this in droves and risking both violations of law and deportation, it's crazy. There's no evidence that this is done, and certainly not any evidence done in a systematic way. So to make the extreme, and I mean extreme, changes to election law, which federalizes it, by the way, my colleagues on the committee, particularly Republican colleagues, are always talking about how these are state elections, and the federal government should not involve itself in state elections. But here we are building a massive set of documentary requirements for people simply to register to vote. It is beyond, certainly given what is suggested is the problem. This is not even a solution in search of a problem. There's no problem, but this is a bad solution. And this would even go so far to potentially subject a poll worker to imprisonment and violating the law and imprisonment, even if they registered a voter who's a U.S. citizen. But if they didn't get all the documentary proof appropriately, they could face fines. I mean, we're already struggling to find people to work in elections, fearful of intimidation, fearful of threats against their life and their families. This will have a chilling effect. It simply is not a problem. And frankly, the couple of cases that were cited before the committee involved a government, state of Pennsylvania, state of Colorado, who made mistakes which they acknowledged, which they immediately went to enormous lengths to clarify, and there's no evidence that non-U.S. citizens are voting in federal elections.
Chairman Steil, are you familiar with Project 2025?
Only at a high level.
I mean, I'd urge you to read up on it a little bit more because it's horrifying. you should take a closer look at what some of your fellow Republicans have been up to. It's a plan to essentially install Trump as a dictator, which is what he said he wants. It's a roadmap to end American democracy, to ban abortion, to dismantle constitutional checks and balances, consolidate power into the Oval Office, and use the presidency for revenge against Trump's personal enemies. And when I say this would end our democracy, I'm not exaggerating. Project 2025 advocates for a terrifying expansion of federal power over the lives of everyday Americans, and it's deeply disturbing, and I encourage every American to look into it. Chairman Steil, do you know who Hans von Spakovsky is?
Yes, he's testified before my committee.
Yeah, because on May 16th, 2024, you and your Republican colleagues on the committee held a hearing on the SAVE Act, echoing election conspiracy theories and praising this bill. And one of the witnesses you called was Hans von Spakovsky, who is the author of Project 2025. When you invited him to testify on behalf of this bill, were you aware that he was one of the leading authors of Project 2025?
I'm familiar with his expertise in federal election law.
Yeah, so on May 23rd, 2024, a dark money think tank associated with the Heritage Foundation issued a public statement in support of the SAVE Act. And the Heritage Foundation is the organization behind the extremist proposals in Project 2025, and they are also publicly supporting the SAVE Act. Do you disavow their support, given what we know about Project 2025? I've explained to you what it does. Is that enough for you to distance yourself from their support of this bill?
Hans von Spakovsky is an absolute national expert in federal election law, was one of many witnesses who testified before us and walked us through, as many of our witnesses did, the challenges that we've seen of non-citizens voting in U.S. elections. It's the reason that this legislation is essential to make sure that we're protecting U.S. elections for U.S. citizens.
Yeah, and I get it. I mean, you've said over and over you think he's a credible. Obviously, you believe the Heritage Foundation is a credible organization, and you believe he's a credible witness. But again, he is one of the major authors of the Project 2025. And you invited Mr. Spakovsky to testify in front of your committee, I think, on 3 separate occasions. Is that correct?
It could be up to 3, yeah. He is a national expert on federal election law.
For the record, my staff actually looked into it. He did testify 3 times. But when I look at this bill, and I look at some of the stuff in Project 2025, there's a lot of crossover here between this bill and Project 2025. And I think, it's one of the fears that we have is that, that this is, again, advancing this very radical idea, and that you would invite the author of Project 2025, one of the architects of this initiative, to basically be, one of your expert witnesses is a little bit disturbing. Let me ask you one final question. Do you think that the president has the authority to mobilize the National Guard to seize ballot boxes in Democratic states?
I'm not familiar with what you're discussing.
Well, I mean, well, let me say, in the last administration, prepared an executive order to do just that. Stephen Miller, who spoke at your press conference when you announced this bill, and who is reportedly also involved in Project 2025, has now apparently said, according to reporting, that he thinks a future Trump administration should nationalize the Guard for deployment in Democratic states. And as I said in my opening statement, this bill is all about sowing distrust and trying to undermine faith in our elections so that your side can continue to use non-existent voter fraud as an excuse to seize power if and when you lose. This is really serious and dangerous stuff. And I would urge you to actually read the Project 2025 proposal. It's something that hasn't been talked very much about. There's some reporting on it. I want to insert unanimous consent to insert 2 articles talking about the connection between Project 2025 and Donald Trump's candidacy. I hope I could.
Without objection.
I got to tell you, I find all this very, very chilling. And again, as I said in my opening statement, I think this is all about you guys fearful that you will lose the next election and trying to find an excuse to, like happened in the last election, to say that it wasn't a free and fair election, that it was a fraudulent election. Every single court in this country said it was a free and fair election. I mean, let me ask you one final question. Do you believe that Donald Trump lost the last election?
I'm pretty sure we're all aware President Biden's the President of the United States.
Well, that's not the answer to the question. The answer is whether you think Donald Trump lost. And the fact that it is so difficult for my Republican friends to even admit that he lost because you're afraid you'll offend him or some of his more extreme supporters, and that you bring people like one of the architects of Project 2025 to come and testify in favor of your bill, to have Stephen Miller at a press conference. Boy, this stuff is not good. I thank you for indulging me. I yield back.